Do you remember the time before time, when rivers were the only kings? Before you were born, before even breath was broken into names, there was a silence between two rivers. Not absence, not void, but a fullness too deep for sound, a hush that pressed against the sky like a hand resting gently on water. It was not dark, it was not light, it was waiting. The land between the Tigris and the Euphrates did not yet know walls or fields or fire. The reeds had not yet been plucked for ink. The clay had not yet hardened into law. There was only the soft murmur of water curling through the earth's veins, as if the planet itself were whispering to something above. You were there not in body, but in dust. Your bones still remember. The rivers moved slowly, like time had not yet decided to run. Their currents brushed against the feet of sleeping gods, or perhaps the feet of no one at all. There were no altars, no sacrifices, no kings to carry war upon their backs. Only sky above and mud below, and in between a kind of sacred breathing. The land did not need to be named. It was known by the wind, by the stars, by the silence. When you walked here, you left no footprints. The ground was not yet asked to remember anything. But the river watched you the way an old tree watches a child, curious and still. Its eyes were not eyes, but light trembling across water. You knelt and cupped your hands, and the water ran through you like prophecy. It did not speak. It did not need to. You were already listening. There were no cities here, not yet. But there were dreams, thick as the mist that rose from the river's skin. You could not see them, but you could feel them hovering just behind your thoughts. Dreams of shape, of fire, of stories waiting to be carved into the face of stone. Even the birds that circled the wetlands sang in tones the gods would later steal. Their cries stitched the sky with sound, then faded into the mud, like seeds not yet ready to bloom. The wind moved slowly across the delta, and each blade of grass bowed as it passed. It was a procession, a ritual, and you, breath held in your chest, felt yourself a part of it. There was no hurry here. The sun rose as if remembering how, and even light moved with reverence. There were no clocks, only shadows on the water. And those, too, drifted slowly, like sacred thoughts still forming in the mind of something divine. At night, the stars came like a quiet storm, not in blazing multitudes, but in careful constellations, each placed as if by hand. They were not yet named, but they were noticed. The river reflected them, and the earth received them. You lay on your back, and the heavens pressed down, not with weight, but with intimacy, as if they wanted you to remember them later, when the sky was crowded with smoke. Do you remember how the reeds swayed? They did not dance for beauty. They moved because the breath of the world was inside them. When the breeze touched them, they bent not in fear, but in worship. Their roots knew something your cities would one day forget, that all things begin in silence, in softness, in surrender. There were fish in the rivers, silver ghosts that darted beneath the surface. They fed not on prey, but on peace. They had no names. You watched them, and they watched you, and for a moment you thought you understood each other, but you had not yet learned to ask questions, and they had no need to answer. The land was sacred because it did not yet try to be. There were no temples, but the sky was wide enough to kneel beneath. There were no scriptures, but every breeze was a verse. There was no God, yet everything breathed like one. You felt it, that pulsing quiet in the earth. It was not trying to teach you. It was simply being, and somehow that was enough. From time to time, a distant thunder rolled across the sky, not as warning, but as heartbeat. Rain would fall not in fury, but in memory. The rivers would swell and the land would drink. And in the soft, wet hush that followed, you would walk through the reeds and hear something you would later call awe. In this land, before law and blade and crown, there was no need to rise. Everything already belonged. The clay did not yet wish to become a brick. It was content to be cradled by water. Even the wind moved with care, as if afraid to wake something holy still sleeping in the soil. And perhaps it was sleeping. Perhaps the gods were not yet born. Perhaps they were dreaming. You were the dreamer's dream, And the land, the mud, the reed, the silent river was the cradle. You were not alone, but you were the only voice not afraid of silence. And so the land listened to you, not for what you said, but for what you felt. And when you finally opened your mouth, the first word that came was not a word at all. It was a sigh, a sound older than speech, and the land between the rivers sighed with you. And so the world began. What if the first humans didn't conquer the land, but whispered? To it you were there, barefoot in the soft, dark mud, where sky and soil met not as strangers, but as lovers. Your hands were not yet calloused by war, not yet hardened by walls or tools. They moved gently, reverently, as if touching the skin of something divine. You did not raise a flag, you knelt. You did not take, you offered. And the earth, old and listening, opened her arms to receive you. It began not with a city, but with a furrow. A single line carved through the soil like a sacred breath. You pressed seed into it, not with ambition, but with hope. You did not know what would grow, but something in your bones remembered the shape of harvest. You had not yet named the seasons, but your shadow watched the sun, and your silence heard the turning of time. The land was generous then, because you did not demand. You touched water like it was prayer. You guided rivers not with force, but with trust, bending them into gentle paths beside your sleeping children. You dug channels with your hands, and the earth did not resist. It remembered you. It remembered when you were dust and wind, and still loved you now that you had weight. Your shelters were not fortresses. They were circles of warmth, woven from reeds and dreams. The wind passed through them without fear, and the stars still shone above your head. You did not lock the night out. You invited it in. You ate beneath it, sang beneath it, loved beneath it. And in the morning you rose with it, your face brushed by the same light that kissed the rivers. You spoke not to be heard, but to remember. Your first words were not commands, they were lullabies. They were warnings sung to the wind. They were names for the way birds curved through the sky or how fire crackled when fed. Language came not as a tool, but as a bridge, a way to say, I am here, and to hear the world say it back. What you built was not civilization, it was belonging. Each word was a root, each sentence a vine. Stories wrapped around your lives like shade trees. You remembered your ancestors not by blood, but by the lessons they planted, when to sow, when to watch the moon, how to speak to a child as if they were older than you. There were no kings yet, only elders whose wrinkles were maps of the sun's journey across the face of time. They did not rule, they reminded. They held the stories in their eyes, and when they spoke, you listened not out of fear, but because their voice sounded like rain. The children did not go to school. They learned by walking, by touching bark, by tasting leaves, by watching the way ants formed rivers of their own across the dust. They learned to be gentle, to leave things as they found them, to take only what the earth offered. And they learned to give thanks not in temples, but with laughter, with shared bread, with hands that helped even when tired. You did not build monuments, you built meaning. A bowl carved from stone became sacred because it fed your grandmother. A flute carved from bone became divine because it made your child sleep. There were no riches, yet you were never poor. You had rhythm, you had roots. You had the pulse of the sky stitched into your breath. You danced not to perform, but to align. You circled fire not to entertain, but to remember that all things moved in spirals, the seasons, the stars, the stories. Your feet knew the beat of the earth long before drums were shaped. Your hips echoed the sway of grain in the wind. And when you leapt for joy, not escape. Your gods were not above you. They were around you in the river's curve, in the bird's cry, in the crack where sunlight broke into a cave. You did not worship them with fear. You welcomed them like guests. You offered fruit. You sang. You listened. And sometimes they listened back, in thunder, in dream, in the way a deer would pause before your path and stare. And when death came, it came gently. You did not fear it, because you had lived close to the soil. You knew you would return to it. Your body would become seed, your breath would become wind. Your name would become a story told at dusk by someone who loved you enough to remember the shape of your hands. You were not forgotten. You were folded back into the earth, into the sky, into the water that still runs. You were not a loss. You were a return. Even now, when the cities roar and the sky hides behind lights, something in you remembers. The way the river bends, the smell of turned soil, the feel of rain on skin before shelter. Even now, your hands ache for something softer than concrete. Your feet dream of walking where no path is carved. You were made not for conquest, but for communion. Not for speed, but for stillness. Not for dominance, but for tending. And the earth, though tired, still remembers your first whisper. It waits for you. It waits for your touch, not to take, but to belong again. Who first dared to speak to the stars, and who first heard them speak back. You stand beneath a sky. Not yet divided, not yet measured by angles and numbers. It hangs above you like a great hush, trembling with breath you cannot name. The stars are not yet constellations. They are not yet counted. They are stories waiting to be told, gods waiting to be born, voices waiting for a listener. And you look up. You do not flinch. You do not turn away. Something inside you recognizes this vastness, not as empty, but as full of watchers, full of memory, full of flame that remembers its maker. You do not know their names yet, but you feel them move slowly like elders gathering at the edge of a fire. One star blinks, another follows. A pattern flickers and suddenly you see it, the face of something greater than you. You lift your hand and trace its outline in the air. A bull maybe, a hunter, a lion roaring into forever. You do not know if it is real, but your soul leans forward listening. The heavens are not silent. They shimmer with speech too slow for ears. They speak in seasons, in cycles, in returns. You begin to notice when a certain star returns to its place, always after the rains, always before the fields bloom. You whisper to it, not in question, but in greeting. You offer it a name, soft and trembling, not to own it, but to remember it. The star accepts. And so the sky becomes a scroll. You carve its patterns into wet clay, into bone, into the skin of memory. A circle for the moon, a jagged line for the thunder god. You are not mapping the stars. You are building a language for awe. Each sign is a gesture, a prayer, a sigh. You do not know it yet, but you are writing the first calendar, the first sacred text, not with ink, but with wonder. Others gather beside you. They too lift their eyes. A child points at the moon and calls it a sister. An old woman weeps before Venus, remembering a love long buried. You are not alone in your looking. Together you become a people of the night, watchers of the silence, keepers of the glowing trail between worlds. You build your temples not beneath, but aligned with the stars, with their risings and settings. You wait for them to rise over the eastern horizon, and when they do, you know it is time to plant, to fast, to mourn, to dance. The sky becomes your compass, your clock, your sacred song. In your dreams, the stars whisper names, Anu, Enlil, Inanna, Nana. You wake with breath caught in your throat, knowing that the gods have passed overhead while you slept. You trace their paths with charcoal and ash. You pour water in bowls and watch it shimmer with their reflection. The heavens have spoken. You remember. And still the question lingers like incense in the air. Are they watching you too? You begin to imagine their gaze, not of judgment, but of witness. That your sorrow is seen. That your joy is echoed in a flicker of starlight. You tell your children that the dead return to the stars, that the righteous become flame. And they believe you because they feel it too, that the sky is not cold. It is waiting. One night you lie alone beside the reeds and you ask the sky a question, not aloud, just in your heart. A small question, tender and aching. A star falls, you gasp. Was that an answer? You do not know, but you weep anyway because something in you has been touched. You begin to mark the movements of the sky with care. A crescent moon appears after the spring flood. A red star flares low when the herons return. You keep count not to control, but to align. You do not rule time. You follow it like a stream, listening for its bends. Soon your people know when eclipses will come, when stars will vanish, when they will return. And with each returning light, a ritual. With each absence, a silence. The heavens become your liturgy, the constellations your cathedral. You do not need walls when the sky opens like this. There are stories now of the twins who became stars, of the serpent that guards the dawn, of the hunter who chased the moon across the sky. They are not myths. They are memory dressed in symbol. They are truths too holy to be told plainly. You begin to wonder if the gods placed these stars not to guide you, but to remind you of what you are not sure. But something deep in your chest pulses when you look up, as if you are remembering something older than breath. And in this remembering, you are not afraid. For if the stars know their paths, if the moon returns without fail, if the sun bows each night and rises again, then perhaps you too are not lost. Perhaps you too are held in some vast, slow circle. You close your eyes beneath the sky, and its weight settles gently upon you, not a burden, a blanket. You were the first to name the heavens. And still they remember your voice. What was the first thing humanity built when it stopped wandering? It was not a fortress. It was not a throne. It was not even a home. It was a temple, a place not for sleeping, but for remembering, a structure not for kings, but for the sky. Arid. You rose from the mud like a quiet prayer made permanent. You remember the feel of the first brick, not heavy, but sacred. It was pressed from clay and breath, shaped by fingers that had only recently stopped wandering. Not to conquer, not to claim, but to belong. The land did not resist. It had been waiting. You walked through reeds where fish once shimmered in silence. You stepped upon earth still soft from rain, and there you knelt, not because you were commanded, but because something ancient stirred beneath your ribs, the feeling that this place was not like the others. It listened when you spoke. It welcomed when you wept. The sky above it opened wide. Eridu was born not from war but from stillness, from the first decision to stay, to say, here we will make something that outlives the day. Here we will shape a circle of stone and call it sacred. Here we will build something that even time must bow to. And so you did. You gathered stone from the riverside. You mixed mud with straw. You pressed it beneath the sun and waited, patient as stars. You did not rush. You were not yet ruled by hours. The rhythm was in the wind, in the breath between songs, in the hush before the dawn. One wall rose, then another, then a platform wide and flat like the hand of a god. Upon it you placed offerings not to appease but to honor, milk, dates, grain. Fragrance curled into the air, smoke that knew the way upward. The gods had no names yet, but they were near. You could feel them not in thunder but in stillness, not in fear but in warmth. You were not afraid, you were seen. The temple in Eridu was small, low to the ground, made with the humility of first things. It did not scrape the sky, it did not dazzle, but it pulsed with memory, with meaning, with a kind of breath that stones should not possess. It was not shelter, it was offering, not protection, invitation. And around it slowly others came. They built near it, not above it. Homes grew like roots around the sacred stem. Fires flickered. Children laughed. The clay paths bore footprints that looped always toward the center. The temple was not a monument, it was a heart. You remember how the priests walked barefoot, robes brushing dust, heads bowed not in power but in listening. They did not command, they watched the sky. They listened to wind. They touched the river and read its moods like a scripture. When it rose too high, they sang. When it dried too long, they wept. This was the age before pride, before kings wore divinity like a mask. In Eridu, the gods were not distant. They walked among you, quiet as dusk, soft as dawn. You offered them not blood but bread, not chains but song. The first written words may have been shaped here not for conquest but for memory. A name scratched into clay, a measure of grain, a prayer for the moon to return. These were not documents. They were whispers made visible. You held them in your palm, warm from the sun, and felt their weight, not of knowledge, but of presence. At night, you climbed the temple steps, just a few, only enough to lift you slightly closer to the stars. You carried a bowl, you carried your sorrow, you said nothing, but the stars blinked, the air shifted, and something deep within you felt answered. Eridu did not roar. It breathed, it did not rise in grandeur. It grew slow as moss, gentle as rain. It did not need walls to feel safe. It had memory instead. It did not need soldiers. It had ceremony. It did not need gold. It had sky, and sky was enough. Even now, beneath dust and ruin, Eridu waits. Its stones remember your hands. Its walls remember your songs. Its temple remembers the warmth of morning prayers. And when the wind moves through those ancient streets, it does not howl. It whispers, come back to where the first staying began, where humanity chose reverence over conquest, where a temple rose before a throne, where belonging was built before empire. You are there still, in the brick, in the prayer, in the silence that gave birth to cities. Can a city remember the river it buried to rise? You walk where the dust forgets your name. Stone beneath your feet, not soft like earth, but stern, shaped, stacked, sealed with heat and order. You have left behind the hush of reeds, the gentle sweep of wind through open field. Here the sky feels farther away. The river no longer touches your ankles. This is Uruk. It rises before you like a memory too large to hold, carved in sun-dried brick, crowned with ziggurats that reach toward the realm of the gods. Its gates are wide, as if made to swallow stars. Its walls are high, as if to keep time itself outside. You look up, and the city does not look back. It is looking beyond you, toward something even older than stone. They say it was built by a king who feared death, who carved his name into every wall, every street, every law, who measured his soul against the sky and found it lacking. You can still hear his voice. See, buried beneath centuries of silence, not in words, but in the ache of towers that stretch too far. And yet beneath all this, the river still remembers. It flows underground now, forgotten by maps but not by roots. Beneath the marketplaces, beneath the temples, it hums, not loudly, just enough for the dust to tremble when no one is watching. It knows what the city cost. It knows what was covered. It knows that no stone is laid without first drowning something soft. You pause at a corner where the scent of incense curls like a question. You hear a priest chanting above the crowd, voice rising like smoke. Offerings line the altar, oil, grain, the broken neck of a dove. The gods of Uruk are not gentle anymore. They want flame. They want blood. They want names. You whisper your own name just to see if it still sounds like yours. There are laws now, etched into stone, proclaimed from thresholds, passed down through fathers who never questioned the fire behind the words. These laws were meant to bring order, but they also brought distance between king and kin, between prayer and mercy, between soul and soil. You remember a time before these walls, when justice was found in the eyes of a neighbor, not on a tablet, when sorrow was shared around a fire, not filed in record. Now people walk past each other without knowing who they pass. Their eyes are fixed ahead, not on each other. Still, in a shaded alley, a child hums a melody older than this city. One her mother sang to her, one her mother's mother sang beside the river. It does not belong here, and yet it survives. The gods watch from above, their statues cold, their faces unreadable. You wonder if they remember being loved instead of feared, if they ever come down to walk the streets, to feel the sun between the bricks, or if they too have forgotten the sound of water. Uruk is a marvel, they say, the envy of empires. The place where the heavens bend closer, where knowledge is etched, where greatness is made. But you feel the sorrow beneath its splendor, like gold hammered too thin, like a song played too often, like a river buried beneath ambition. The people here speak in scripts. Their hands carry styluses instead of seeds. Their homes are square, their lives measured. A child is born and weighed. A man dies and is counted. But you wonder, is anything sacred that is not first touched by the unknown? The ziggurat looms ahead. You climb its steps slowly, each one worn by centuries of desire. Kings once stood here, arms raised to the sky, demanding answers. You stand in their place, but you ask nothing, you only listen. And in the wind you hear it faint like the ghost of water through reeds, the river remembering you, remembering itself, longing not to rise but to be noticed. At night Uruk does not sleep, its fires glow, its voices murmur. But the stars above remain the same ones that shimmered over open fields. They are unchanged, watching, waiting, whispering to those who still look up. You do. You lie on a rooftop, arms stretched, and you remember the river, its bend, its silence, its gift. You remember how it asked for nothing but respect, how it gave without needing temples, how it held you before any wall was built. And for a moment you wonder, if Uruk fell, would the river rise again? Would it flow freely through the bones of the city, washing away names, smoothing the sharp edges, carrying back the song? You close your eyes. You do not dream of towers, you dream of water. You dream of walking without stone beneath your feet. You dream of the gods bending low, not to command but to listen. And when you wake, the wind carries dust through the streets. But in it you hear something soft, not the cry of empire, but the voice of the buried river calling you home. What would you build to touch the sky if God once lived among you? You remember the stories, that once he walked here, not above, not beyond, but among, that his breath stirred the wheat, that his voice came in wind, soft as a mother's hum, that he passed by unseen but known, felt in the hush that followed rain. He needed no throne, the whole world was his chamber. But then he rose, or we fell, and so you built. You lifted stone upon stone, not to shelter the body, but to shelter the ache, to house the longing, to give shape to a reaching that had no end. You built with your back, but dreamed with your throat. You sang as you laid brick, not to pass time, but to carry it, to call down a presence that no longer walked through the garden. The ziggurat rose slowly, not like a monument, like a memory. A sacred remembering of closeness, of nearness, of sky once bent low. Each step was not just height, it was hope. A stair carved from clay and vision, a way to climb not the mountain but the silence. You did not build to see the stars, you built so they would see you. The air changed the higher you climbed. It grew thinner, quieter, like the space between prayers. Birds flew past with more freedom than your limbs, but you did not envy them. You were building wings of another kind, not for escape, but for return. At the base, the people gathered. They watched you ascend with reverence, not curiosity. For each rise of the ziggurat was a rise within them too. When one ascended, all did. When one priest reached the summit, the whole city held its breath. Would the heavens answer? You remember the offerings, bowls of oil, bundles of dates. Fire lit at twilight, the smoke carried upward as if it knew the way. The gods were not cruel, just distant, but still you believed in reaching, in rising, in ritual. You touched the upper platform with bare feet. There was no roof, no covering, only sky, only wind, and the feeling that something unseen had turned its face toward you, that here between dust and stars your voice might carry farther, that your silence might be heard as song. You whispered not commands, but questions. Are you still near? Do you still remember our names? And sometimes a breeze would move across your skin. Sometimes a bird would cry just then. Sometimes the air would shift, and you would weep without knowing why. This was not superstition. This was sacred architecture. This was longing shaped in stone, not an attempt to seize God, but to tell him we still want you. Each ziggurat held the ache of 1,000 backs, the prayer of 1,000 hands. They were not palaces, they were ladders, not for descent but for remembrance. Heaven had closed, but you would knock. You built tall not to rule but to remember, to recall the garden, the voice, the breath in the trees, to say we have not forgotten how close you once were. And what of now? Now the ziggurats lie broken. Worn, their steps cracked, their altars dust. The sky no longer leans near. The gods no longer speak in dreams, but the stones still remember. The clay still hums with longing. You walk their ruins slowly, barefoot still, as if the silence deserves it. You place your hand on a sun-warmed brick and feel a pulse, not of blood, of memory, of the sacred urge to rise. You wonder, if you built again, would he come again? If you shaped a space not of conquest, but of stillness, not of ambition, but of ache, would the breath return? The ziggurat was not just structure, it was sacrifice. Each step was a prayer pressed into earth, each climb a confession, each height a hallelujah held in mud. Even now, when your towers rise for gold instead of God, something in you remembers the first ascent, the holy climb, the trembling hope. Even now, as you sleep beneath ceilings not stars, part of you still builds in the dark, stacking silence upon silence, breath upon breath, dream upon dream. You still build, not to reach the heavens, but to remind them you are still reaching, still listening, still remembering that once God walked here, and you have never stopped building your way back. When did the voice of the king become the voice of heaven? You remember a time before thrones, when wisdom lived in the wrinkles of elders and justice sat beneath the trees, not above them. When men did not wear crowns to be obeyed, but walked among their people like brothers, like fathers, like fire tending flesh. But then came the kings. They rose slowly, first as shepherds, then as warriors, then as something more. They spoke louder, walked taller, built higher. And in the hush that followed war, in the silence after harvest, they stood before the people and said, "The gods have chosen me." You did not question it, not at first, for they spoke with certainty. They moved like fate, and something in their eyes glimmered with fire not born of man. You saw them lift their hands and command floods to be tamed, stones to be raised, lives to be weighed. You heard them decree when a man should weep, when a woman should mourn, when a child should be named. And you believed. Their words were carved in stone, not for beauty, but for permanence. The law was no longer spoken, it was etched. It could not be undone, not even by those who bled for it. The king became the mouth of the divine, and silence fell where once there was question. You watched as scribes gathered in courtyards, copying decree after decree, while the king's voice echoed across walls that reached toward heaven. He no longer sought permission, he gave it. He no longer prayed, he received prayer. The people bowed not to God, but to the one who claimed to carry his voice. What is law, you wondered, when it forgets the hands it binds? When it serves the crown but not the cradle? When it praises the builder but forgets the bricklayer? You saw men hanged for stealing grain in famine, while the granaries of kings overflowed. You saw women cast out for breaking bonds the king himself had shattered in secret. You saw a child orphaned by war kneel before a temple guard, begging for mercy, and the guard looked to the stone, not his heart. The stone said nothing, and yet. Some part of you remembered that once justice was water. It flowed. It knew when to wait, when to rise, when to disappear. Now it stood still. Now it cracked beneath the sun, held rigid in decree, no longer able to bend without breaking. The king called himself the shadow of the god upon the earth. He wore robes embroidered with stars. He bathed in oils pressed from sacred groves. He sat atop thrones shaped like lions, like eagles, like beasts who never bowed to man until now. And you wondered, did the gods speak through him, or did he learn to speak like the gods? You knelt in the courtyard of a ziggurat, head bowed before a judge sent by the palace. You spoke truth, but the law had already spoken, and truth is not always the same as judgment. The edicts flowed faster than the rivers. Rules for the weight of silver, the price of bread, the rights of a man to his wife, the rights of a master to his slave. They reached into the womb, into the grave, into the breath of everyday life, all stamped with the seal of divinity. But where was mercy? Where was the voice that once said, "You are my people and I will not forsake you"? You saw a man refuse the king's command. He did not raise his fist. He raised a question, and that too became a crime. His name was erased, his family scattered, his fields given to another. And the people watched in silence, learning the lesson carved deeper than law, that the voice of the king was not to be echoed, only obeyed. And yet, something in you stirred, a quiet rebellion in the soul, a whisper beneath the stone. The gods you once knew, they did not need thrones. They walked the fields. They wept with you. They passed through storms and dreams, not through scrolls and soldiers. You looked up at the stars one night, far from the walls of the city, and asked the sky, "Do you still hear us or only him?" The wind did not answer, but it moved, and that was enough. Because even as the king's words hardened into iron, you still remembered the softness of the old songs, the way a mother rocked her child not by decree, but by instinct, the way elders solved quarrels with listening, not punishment, the way law once flowed from love, not fear. You began to see it in hidden places. A father forgiving a debt not because he must, but because he can. A woman feeding the hungry without permission. A scribe who copies not just the law but a poem in the margin, a prayer not approved by palace but by heart. And you wondered, what if the voice of heaven was not loud, not royal? What if it came again as it once did, in wind, in water, in whisper? What if justice was not what the king declared, but what the earth remembered? And what if someday the stone cracked, and mercy spoke again, not through throne but through you? What does it mean to be remembered longer than your bones survive? You walk in the shadow of a man whose name outlived his breath. A king carved into time, not just ruler of a city, but of a sorrow so vast that the gods themselves bent to hear it. You know him, though you were born thousands of years too late. His name reaches you not through blood, but through myth, slow as water through stone. Gilgamesh. He was not like others, taller, stronger, crueler in his youth, made not entirely of man, 2/3 divine, they said, born of gods and dust, breath and bronze. He did not sleep like others, he did not laugh like others. His dreams burned, his hands built towers, his feet shook the paths they walked. And yet it was not glory that made him eternal, it was grief. You watch him rise fierce and radiant. His city, Uruk, gleamed with walls taller than the trees. He laid them brick by brick, pressed with the force of his longing, not just to rule but to be more than man. He hunted monsters, broke chains, dared the mountains to fall. He mocked the gods with courage, and for a time they let him believe. But then came Enkidu, not a servant, not a subject, a friend, a man born of wilderness and silence, hair like field grass, breath like rain. He spoke few words, but his presence changed everything. Gilgamesh no longer shouted to the heavens. They wrestled, and in the struggle they became one, brothers made not by blood but by awe. With Enkidu, Gilgamesh laughed for the first time like he meant it. They journeyed together side by side into forests where the cedars grew too tall for pride. They faced Humbaba, the demon guardian, and slew him. They turned gods into foes, but they did it together. And in that togetherness, Gilgamesh found what he feared more than death, love. For love meant loss, and loss came swiftly. You remember the dream. A darkness over the city, a vulture shadow, Enkidu fevered, lying still while even the gods looked away. No sword could strike death, no wall could stop it, no prayer could bargain it back. And when Enkidu died, Gilgamesh broke, not his kingdom, himself. He tore his robes, he left the throne, he walked in. To wilderness barefoot, like an orphan of the sky. His questions had no answers. His voice, once like thunder, cracked into whisper. Is this all? Is this how it ends? Do even kings rot beneath the dirt? He sought Utnapishtim, the one man said to have survived the flood, the one said to have cheated death. He crossed oceans of stone, mountains that wept. He walked through tunnels where the sun itself did not enter. His hair grew long, his face hollowed. He was no longer a king, but a wound. And when he found the immortal man, he did not raise his sword. He fell to his knees. "How do I live forever?" he asked. Utnapishtim told him the truth: "You don't." The gods had made a boundary, life and death, flesh and forgetting. Even kings could not cross it. Even those born of gods would sleep. And no ladder could be built tall enough to outrun the grave. Gilgamesh wept again, not for Enkidu, not for himself, but for all that would vanish, every city, every song, every child who laughed beside the river and was swallowed by time. But then he returned, not with immortality but with memory. He carved his story into stone, not to boast but to remember, not to live forever but to say, "I was here, I loved, I wept, I tried." And that is how you know him, not through bone but through word. He who could not conquer death conquered forgetting. And so now you walk where he once walked. You speak his name though his dust is lost to wind. You carry his grief like it is your own, because it is. You too have loved, you too have wept, you too have asked the night, how can something so sacred end? But maybe it doesn't. Maybe in telling the story you keep it breathing. Maybe in whispering his name you light the torch again. Maybe that is what it means to live forever, not in flesh, but in the hearts that remember. And now you do, Gilgamesh, king, brother, seeker, griever. Human, you are not alone in your sorrow. He walked through it first and left you this. What if the gods were only kings too proud to bleed? You walk among ruins now. Once these stones were voices. Once they commanded the wind. Once they bore names no man dared whisper without kneeling. But now only dust clings to them. The throne has no weight. The crown has no head to rest on. The god-king is gone, and the silence has begun to speak. You feel it beneath your feet, this soft undoing. You step on what was once a road carved with triumphs. Chariots rolled here, banners flew, feet marched in praise of a man who claimed the sky itself had chosen him. He said the gods breathed through his lips. That justice poured from his gaze. That stars moved because his name had been spoken. But stars do not bow, and names can be forgotten. He called himself eternal, but nothing is eternal that must be fed by fear. You remember how he was born, not in fire, but in prophecy. A boy bathed in oils, swaddled in omen. His mother whispered to the priests, he will rule not just the people, but the seasons. His first cry was marked by thunder. His footsteps were counted by astrologers. Even before he spoke, he was sacred. They raised him high, carved his face into cliffside, fashioned the laws in his voice. He was not merely king, he was order, balance, breath, and still he hungered. He took land because he believed the earth owed him. He took wives because he believed his blood was holy. He took lives because he feared forgetting. He stamped his seal upon grain, upon gold, upon the moon's phases. And he stood atop his tallest tower and asked the sky, "Is there any greater than I?" The sky said nothing, but it listened. And somewhere in that stillness the unraveling began. It did not come with swords. It came with slow decay. The people grew tired of bowing. The scribes began to question what they wrote. The river changed its course, and the priests no longer knew how to name the flood. A sickness crept through the cattle. The markets thinned. The sun did not rise late, but it felt farther away. You were there standing at the edge of the city. You saw the first statue fall, not shattered, just leaned. A gesture almost like it was bowing to something deeper. A storm came and the banners tore. The walls cracked where the king's name had been etched. Still, he sat in his hall, surrounded by silence. His voice tried to echo, but it sounded like dust scraping dust. And when he died, no god claimed him. No light fell from the heavens. No bird circled 3 times. Only his servants laid him down, wrapped him in cloth, placed him in the tomb he had built with pride. A tomb that now floods when the rains are too heavy. And so the god-king fell, not in fire, not in wrath, but in forgetfulness. Not even his son remembered the sound of his laugh. The temples that praised him now hold echoes of other names. The laws he wrote have been softened, broken, replaced. The statues crumble, the stories fade. The throne sits cold beneath the weeds, and still the stars shine, still. The river flows. You touch the stone where his title once glowed in gold. You feel no tremble, no awe, only a sadness not for him, but for all who believed he could carry heaven. And yet the lesson remains: what falls was never divine, what breaks was never eternal, what rules by fear will always be ruled by time. You look out beyond the ruins and you see others rising. New kings, new names, new voices claiming divinity. But you are not fooled now. You know what lies beneath the robe, beneath the crown, beneath the incense and thunder. It is flesh. It is fear. It is a man hoping no one sees how deeply he longs to be loved. And you ask yourself, what is power without mercy? What is holiness without humility? What is a god-king if not a man afraid to die? The wind moves through the broken temple, slow and soft, like breath returning to where it was once taken. No guards, no decree, no flame, only silence. And in that silence, truth. You do not kneel here, you remember. And in remembering, you rise. What sacred truth would you write if it had to last 10,000 years? You kneel in the shade of a temple, bent not in worship, but in witness. The sun rests heavy above you, but you do not lift your head. Before you lies a slab of clay, wet and waiting. In your hand, a reed, not a weapon, not a tool of war, but something softer, something ancient. Something quiet. You are a scribe. The world does not call your name when victories are sung. No trumpets sound for you. No statues rise in your honor. And yet when the kings are gone and the walls are dust, your marks remain pressed into time like footprints left in drying earth. You do not rule. You remember. You dip the reed in ink, though sometimes there is no ink at all, only silence. You press lines into the clay, careful, deliberate, as though each stroke must last forever. Because it must, you are not simply writing words, you are capturing breath, the sigh of a dying elder, the debt owed between neighbors, the measure of grain that saved a family from hunger, the birth of a child, the rising of a star, the names of the gods when they still walked among us. You are not recording fact, you are preserving presence. The reed does not tremble in your hand, for it knows it was chosen. It was plucked not just from a riverbank, but from the seam between worlds, where memory waits to be remembered. You hold it like a priest holds a bone, reverently, like it carries the soul of something long buried. You press a name into the clay, a name no one else remembers, a girl who danced in a field, a man who sang to the rain, a child who died before being named. You give them back to time, you give them a place to sleep. The stylus carves more than language, it carves longing. Fear, hope, warnings for those not yet born, please send upward to gods who no longer answer. Songs of love so tender they crack the stone, laws shaped by trembling hands, prophecies sealed in jars and buried for centuries. You know the words will dry, you know they may never be read, but still you write, because someone must. The king builds cities, the priest builds temples, but you build time. You listen to voices the wind forgets. You hold moments the sky no longer sees. You carry memories too fragile for the world to keep. And when no one else watches, you write them into clay as though clay were a womb. And it is. The words curl, baked in the sun, hardened by fire. They are small, but they do not fade. They outlast conquest. They outlast empire. They whisper through centuries in symbols most will never read, but still feel. You write for the future, not because it will listen, but because it deserves the chance to. You write slowly. Not from lack of knowledge, but because each mark is a prayer. Each edge a doorway. You do not hurry. You trace the past like you're tracing your own face, careful, intimate, afraid to forget, afraid to let go. What if no one remembers? What if everything you love disappears? You answer with a reed. And so the tablet fills not with noise but with meaning. You speak through silence. You leave room for breath. You write the sky, the flood, the laughter of women weaving at twilight. The cruelty of rulers, the cost of bread. The year the moon vanished for 3 nights. The scent of cedar, the dreams of shepherds. And somewhere between these marks you leave a piece of yourself, not your name, just your hands, just your reverence, just your choice to remember when forgetting was easier. The sun shifts. The clay hardens, you rise, the wind passes over the tablet. It does not erase, it does not judge, it simply carries the heat of what you have given. Somewhere downriver, another scribe begins. Somewhere inland, another tablet is cracked open. Somewhere, a child learns a letter shaped like the one you carved. And so it goes. You are a scribe, you do not shout, you do not rule, you do not forget. And long after the kings are gone, you will still be whispering. What if the most important thing ever written was a poem to someone now dust? You open a tablet once buried beneath a floor. It is no bigger than your hand. Its corners are worn, its edges chipped, its surface cracked like dry earth. But within it, breath. Within it, the hush of someone who once whispered, "I love you," beneath a sky that no longer remembers the shape of their voice. The clay remembers. Before empire etched its commands, before kings pressed fear into stone, someone wrote of barley and kisses, of a woman who moved like moonlight through a market, of a child's first laugh, of a debt forgiven not because it was paid, but because it was kind. The scribes did not only write for the rulers, they wrote for the seasons, for the sheep who wandered too far, for the granaries filling with seed, for the lovers who dreamed beside riverbanks, hearts tethered not to law, but to longing. One tablet reads, "The bread rose with the morning, and so did my joy." Another says, "Her hand in mine is lighter than rain." These are not declarations of conquest, they are reminders of being, a farmer's record of grain, not for pride, but to know he had enough to share, a mother's note of her child's height, a receipt for honey, a spell to ease pain, a lullaby pressed in signs so small, only hands aching with love could have shaped them. You sit with these words and they do not shout, they hum. They hum with markets before sunrise, with girls sweeping doorways, with fathers fixing sandals, with neighbors calling across rooftops, with bakers rising before the stars fade, and still, beneath it all, the steady rhythm of wheat. The wheat was sacred, not because it fed kings, but because it fed everyone, because each grain was a promise that tomorrow might be full, that the child would not cry from hunger, that the gods still remembered how to be generous. And so the scribes wrote of wheat, how much was taken, how much was owed, how much was shared after the flood. You see a line written in haste, as if the hand was trembling, "Give the widow 2 handfuls more." That is law, that is love. They wrote of debts, but also forgiveness, of contracts, but also blessings. They wrote the rules not as chains, but as scaffolding for trust. You could see it in the way a transaction always ended with a line about fairness, about peace, about the gods who watched. But not all was order. There are tablets where longing burns through the dust, love letters from wives to husbands gone for too long, lines that ask, "Do you still remember the way my voice felt?" or "Come back before the rains." There are poems carved for daughters on the brink of womanhood, for sons about to marry. There are fragments of friendship, old men writing to one another about aching backs, about memories that return at dusk, about laughter they once buried in wine. None of this was meant to rule the world. It was meant to hold it. One scribe wrote a recipe for stew passed from her grandmother's hands. Another noted the date of the eclipse, not because it was ominous, but because her child was born that night. Someone carved a single line with no name attached. "He died before spring." You do not need to know who he was. You only need to feel the weight of the silence that followed. And still, it goes on. Instructions for planting beside a crescent moon. Warnings about thieves, records of weddings, lists of sheep, complaints about the cost of fish, prayers for rain, prayers of thanks, prayers for the soul of a goat that served a family well. Even now, buried beneath ruins, these tablets breathe. You can almost hear them, not with your ears, but with something older. A knowing in your bones that says, "We lived, we loved, we fed each other." We remembered to write it down. And what of you? What will your hands record? Not just the wars and the years, but the scent of your mother's shawl, the exact weight of a plum in your palm, the first time you touched another and did not feel afraid, the sound of your name in the mouth of someone who whispered it with awe. You do not need stone, only breath, only stillness, only the reverence to know that small things endure longer than empires. And now you turn back to the tablet and read again the line etched with the softest care, I miss you when the wheat ripens. And suddenly, you understand civilization. What happens when the earth itself becomes your diary? You kneel before the dust, not in prayer but in listening. There, just beneath your breath, the soil remembers you. The earth has not forgotten. Your name may be lost, your footsteps vanished, your tears long dried, but the clay remembers. It remembers what the wind carried. It remembers what the water whispered. It remembers the weight of your hand pressing meaning into mud. In a time when breath could vanish with the river's turn, you shaped memory from earth. You were a scribe of silence, not with ink, not with voice, but with a stylus dipped in reverence. Upai. Said wet clay, and it held your secrets longer than stone ever could. Thousands of years later, the tablet still speaks, not in a voice but in a weight. It hums beneath glass in a museum, but it was never meant to be displayed. It was meant to be buried, hidden, slept with, touched. It was meant to remember what the body could not. And what does it remember? That a woman once paid 5 measures of barley for a handful of wool, that a man prayed for his brother's health and sealed it in clay. That kings declared their laws, that poets carved their hunger, that widows documented dreams, that orphans recorded rain. It remembers famine and flood, harvest and moonrise, birth and betrayal, love and loss. But more than that, it remembers you tried to hold time in your hand. The clay did not judge what you wrote. It did not ask if your words were worthy. It only received. It only held. Like a mother cupping the fragile breath of a sleeping child, the earth cradled what you gave it without condition. What if the sky forgot, but the ground still remembered? There are tablets broken in half, scattered across ruins, carried by looters, cracked by time. But even in fragments, the memory remains. One edge holds the name of a priest. Another contains a hymn to a god no one prays to anymore. Another simply says, it rained today and we rejoiced. You do not need the full story. Even a shard is a psalm. The clay does not boast. It does not weep. It waits, and still it breathes beneath you. Even when empires rose and fell, even when fire consumed palaces and rivers redrew borders, the tablets stayed buried. They survived where bones did not. They remembered where voices failed. And isn't that what you long for? To be remembered, not as a statue, not as a monument, but as a whisper in the ground, a fragment, a line, a heartbeat made solid. The stylus moved like prayer, pressed gently, then deeper, then gone, and the clay held it all. There is a tablet that says only, he did not return. There is another, the child smiled when he saw the sun again. These are not stories, they are breaths. Cuneiform, the sacred wedge-shaped tongue, was not merely language. It was the imprint of a soul trying to endure. Every line, every notch, every angle a pulse, a reaching, a promise to the future. I was here, I touched the world. Let it not forget me. And you, wandering through this age of vanishing names and fleeting words, you wonder if you will last. But you have already written in dust, with your footsteps, with your tears, with the way you held someone when they were about to break. Not all memory is carved in clay, some is carved in kindness. Still, you are drawn to those ancient tablets, not because they tell you what happened, but because they prove something did, because the earth agreed to remember. So now you press your palm into the soil. You feel the hush, you feel the weight, you feel the clay holding you like it held them. And in that sacred silence you ask, if I whispered now, would you keep it for me? And the earth, without moving, answers, I already have. Who is the goddess who could rise each morning and still dream of the grave? You feel her before you see her. a warmth in your throat, a stirring in your spine, the hush before a storm, the breath before desire. She is not gentle, she is not cruel. She is Inanna, the queen of heaven, the hunger of earth, the one who dared to undress before death and speak her own name in the dark. She rises with the morning star, Venus trembling on the edge of sky, and every eye that watches her rise forgets what it once feared. She walks in silk and fire. She walks in blood and perfume. Her feet touch battlefields, her lips kiss prayers. She is the goddess of love and war because she knows they are not opposites. You were told that to be divine was to be still, but she moves, she roars. She dances with spears in her hands and lilies in her hair. Do you see her yet? Inanna, who wears 7 names and 7 veils. Inanna, who does not wait to be worshipped, but carves her name into your longing. And still, even she descended. She left the heavens and stepped into the land where nothing grows. The underworld, not for conquest, not for rule, but for truth. She took off her crown. Then her earrings, then her necklace. At each gate she was stripped, of symbols, of power, of illusion. By the time she stood naked before Ereshkigal, her shadow self, she was only Inanna, not goddess, not queen, just the ache that lives in all who dare to know themselves. Can you kneel like that? Can you walk downward, shedding pride, armor, story? She did. She died. And for 3 days and nights there was no sunrise, no song, no breath, until the mourners came, until the mourners wept. Not for the goddess they lost, but for the truth they forgot, that even divinity breaks, that even light must be buried to be born again, and from death she rose, not untouched, not unchanged. She returned wearing silence like a new skin. She had met the mirror beneath the world, and it had not destroyed her. Now she walks between things, between man and woman, between life and death, between power and surrender. She is the scream before battle. She is the sigh after love. She is the moment you realize you are not what they named you. Inanna does not ask you to worship. She asks you to descend. She does not offer comfort. She offers transformation. She is every part of you that longs to be whole. Every secret you buried in your ribs, every flame you called too much, every river you thought could drown you, but instead carried you back to yourself. They built temples for her in Uruk. They wrote hymns for her with trembling hands, but her true altar is the space inside your chest that refuses to be small. She is the goddess who says yes to everything you are, the chaos, the beauty, the ache, the rage, the softness that no longer wants to hide. When you wake before dawn and feel a storm behind your eyes, that is her. When you burn for something you cannot name, that is her. When you rise after falling and do not apologize, that is her. Inanna, queen of heaven, Inanna, lover of Dumuzi, Inanna, breaker of silence. Do not look for her only in the stars. Look in the mirror when your eyes are still swollen from weeping. Look in the fire that did not ask your permission to light. Look in the shadow that stopped chasing and began guiding. And when you hear her voice, not loud, not soft, but eternal, do not run. Say yes, say your name, say you remember who you were before forgetting was survival. Inanna does not belong to gods. She belongs to the woman who once believed her softness was a sin, to the warrior who never wanted a sword but picked one up anyway, to the child who asked too many questions and now builds temples in their mind. She is not a story, she is a return. And when you rise tomorrow, blinking beneath the same star that kissed her brow, know this. You have already descended, you have already died, and still you rose, so whisper it now as she did in the dark, I am not broken, I am becoming. What if your God could love you and still flood your home? You have known wind, it touches your skin and vanishes. It stirs the wheat, kisses the cheeks of the child and carries the scent of rain. But wind also howls. It breaks trees at the root. It tears the roof from the mouth of your shelter. And when it comes in silence, it brings breath. When it comes in rage, it brings the flood. This is Enlil, the unseen force behind all motion, the God who gave air its voice and gave silence its weight. You did not see him, but you felt when he turned his face. He was the keeper of breath, not just yours, but the world's. Can you imagine such a power? Not the god of smiles or songs, but the god of balance. The one who decides, not with love nor hatred, but with rhythm. You woke to the east wind and did not bow. The ancients did. They built ziggurats to speak closer to him. They wrote prayers on clay, pleading for favor, pleading for mercy, knowing both were the same hand. Enlil is not like the others. He does not hold a staff or wear a crown. He holds the air between your ribs. He wears the invisible. His is the breath that gives you life, and the storm that takes it back. He once looked upon the noise of humankind and grew weary. The cities had multiplied. The lands had been carved and tamed. And in that fullness, something broke. The world had forgotten quiet, forgotten the sacred hush that came before the beginning. So he sent the flood, not as punishment, but as a reset. Can you bear that truth, that your God might drown you not out of anger, but to restore the song you silenced? It was Enlil who whispered the wind that warned the reeds. Enlil who stirred the sky until the heavens wept for 7 days and nights. Enlil who flooded not just rivers, but memory. And yet, Enlil also gave kingship. Enlil also gave grain. He blessed the ones who remembered the wind, the ones who stepped outside temples and felt the pulse of the sky. He gave dreams to shepherds and power to cities. He raised Sumer on pillars of cloud. You are not meant to understand him. You are meant to feel him in the moment just before a storm, in the cradle of a child's first breath, in the silence that falls after your last scream. He is not cruel. He is not kind. He is. The paradox, creation and erasure, breath and flood, gift and grief. And so you ask, how could a God love you and still flood your home? Because love is not always protection. Sometimes love is interruption. Sometimes love is silence loud enough to break you open. The Mesopotamians feared him, but they also thanked him, because without his storms, the rivers would never rise. Without his winds, the seeds would never scatter. Without his destruction, there would be no space to begin again. He is the lesson you do not want, but the one that saves you when your life falls apart. Why? Our plans are washed away when the winds tear through the house you built with trembling hands. It is not always cruelty. Sometimes it is Enlil, making room for your breath to be your own again. He does not dwell in temples. He dwells in the pause between thunder and rain. In the moment your chest tightens and then loosens again. He is the storm that leaves behind fertile ground. And he watches. He watches as you rise from the mud. He watches as you rebuild what you thought was lost. He watches as you breathe still even after the flood. Enlil is not easy, but he is sacred. He is the breath of balance, the rhythm of ruin and renewal. So tonight, if the wind howls, do not curse it. Listen, it may be your God speaking. It may be your life beginning again. What was the last place on earth where a prayer had weight? You step into silence. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something deeper. Something that watches without eyes, listens without ears, waits without breath. This is not a building. It is not even a place. It is a wound in the world where the sky once opened and never fully closed. You feel it beneath your feet, stone worn smooth by bare soles, by pilgrims who walked not to arrive but to disappear. You are inside a temple, but not a temple as you imagine. This is not a place to sit and listen. This is a place to burn and rise, to offer, to dissolve. The Mesopotamians did not build temples for people. They built them for the gods. They built them so the heavens could kneel to earth, and the earth could offer its smoke and sorrow. The ziggurats rose not to reach the divine, but to make it descend. Tiered like steps in the mind, each level an ascent into unknowing, each chamber a room for awe to echo. And at the summit, there was not a throne, there was a bed, a place for the god to sleep, to dream in the world of men, to listen in silence as incense curled like questions toward the stars. You place your palm against the wall, sun-baked brick, still holding warmth from centuries of prayers. You feel it, that someone once wept here, Someone once asked for rain, for a sun to live, for a love not to fade, and the wall remembers. Temples were not visited, they were entered, like wombs of stone, like mouths that whispered back. The priestess walked barefoot. Her hair was unbound. Her voice sang in tongues lost to the dust. She was not a woman, she was the breath of the goddess herself. Men bowed not to her, but to what moved through her. Not worship, but fear and wonder braided tight. And in the deepest rooms, where light did not enter, offerings were placed, dates, beer, blood, figs, gold, as if to say, we remember you, please remember us. Not all who entered returned the same. Some saw visions, some heard names, some simply broke, because the gods did not ask for belief, they asked for space, for a chamber in the body of the city where their breath could rest, where they could hear again what humanity had forgotten how to say. Even now you can feel it, when you stand beneath old ceilings, when sunlight slips like honey across ancient stone, when a hush falls over a ruin as if time itself is bowing. That is a temple remembering you. You wonder, don't you, what it would be like to live in a world where prayers had architecture, where silence had walls, where belief left footprints in brick. The ancients believed the gods fed on presence, not meat or incense, but attention, focus, awe, and the temple was a feast of awe, the ceiling painted with stars, the floor traced with channels of sacred oil. Even the doorways were aligned with the breath of the wind so that nothing could enter that was not meant to. You breathe in now, and something breathes with you. The temple was always alive. Not haunted, inhabited. And when the priests washed the idols, when they clothed them, when they sang to them at dawn, it wasn't decoration, it was recognition. Because to speak to a god, you must treat them as real. How long has it been since your soul had a room, a chamber for grief, a roof for joy, a gate where your doubt could kneel and your longing rise? In Mesopotamia, those rooms were built, not to contain divinity, but to make it touchable. The temples stood as lungs of the cities, breathing spirit into markets, into fields, into homes. And when they fell, when sand took them grain by grain, so too fell the weight of prayer. But still beneath the earth the foundations whisper. Still in dreams people see stairs that climb into night. Still in your longing you know you once stood in a place where the sky could listen. So close your eyes. Listen for the silence that listens back. You are not far from the temple. You are inside it. What happens when the heavens can no longer bear your prayers? The wind does not stir tonight. And yet you feel it, the hush before weeping, the ache before the wave. The sky has turned its face, not in wrath, in weariness. You were not there when the gods decided. Be. But the air remembers, the clay remembers, even your bones, ancient and quiet beneath your skin, remember. The world had grown too loud. The voices of men did not rise in gratitude but in greed, not in awe but in noise. So the gods, once drunk on incense and praise, tasted bitterness in the breath of cities. And one of them, who once gifted the plough, who once laughed at offerings of dates and honey, now turned his gaze away. The decision did not fall like a thunderbolt. It slipped like a whisper between divine mouths. Too many, too loud, too cruel. They had tried before with drought, with plague, with silence. But still the cities spread like oil across water, slick and shimmering, carrying fires into places meant for stars. So the gods wept, not out of pity but fatigue, a grief that had no more room to give. And thus the flood was not a punishment. It was surrender, a letting go. The earth cracked with thunder, but the storm was not rage. It was despair falling like a curtain. The rivers forgot their beds. The clouds unspooled their sorrow, and the sky fell. You watch from a wooden vessel that creaks like an old prayer. The rain is not cold. It is warm like tears sliding down a fevered face. Below you the world is unmade, temples swallowed, songs drowned before they reached their end. No hands remain to lift the sacred bread, no fire to kiss the statues, only water, only forgetting, and still you breathe. The god Enki whispered to you in the dark, a warning not of fury but of collapse. Build a boat, he said, not to escape wrath but to float atop sorrow, to survive the undoing. You gather animals but they do not speak. They only look at you as if they too know that this salvation is only partial, that some things will not return. The boat lifts. It does not sail. It drifts, a coffin with a heartbeat. The flood waters rise not like an army, but like a sigh that never ends. And for days without number you drift, not toward a future but away from memory. You think of the ones you loved, the old man who carved reeds into flutes, the child who traced gods into sand, the woman whose laughter braided mornings into gold, gone not for sin, but for being too many, too much, too loud. When the rain stops, there is no celebration, only silence. A silence so wide even the gods do not speak. You send a bird, then another, then another. But the sky is empty, and your heart, hollowed by the flood, does not rejoice. Then a branch, green, still alive, you cry, but the tears do not fall. You have given too many to the sea. When you step upon the mountain, you are not thankful, you are broken. You kiss the earth not with joy but with grief. And the gods, looking down, are ashamed. They breathe deep, not in pride but in guilt. They promise never again, not because you deserve it, but because they remember what it means to feel. The flood had cleansed the world, but it had also emptied the divine. You build an altar. You offer flame not as tribute but as memory, a flame that says, we are still here, we who remember the gods accept, not with thunder, with silence. And silence is enough, because the flood was not meant to teach, it was meant to end. But you became the psalm that followed, the soft, cracked voice that rose from wet clay, the whisper that said, even after drowning I will speak. And the heavens, once exhausted by prayer, listen, because you no longer shout, you sing, low, broken, beautiful. Like the sky after rain, you were not chosen because you were perfect. You were chosen because you remembered. Long before the winds lifted the seas, before the gods wept behind their bright veils, you heard the silence growing beneath the soil. It was not just thunder that foretold the end. It was the stillness in the trees, the way animals began to walk in pairs, the unease in the shadows of lamps, the breath held between stars. Your name was Atrahasis. But in the dark, you were only a man who listened, and that was enough. You built not for yourself, but for the echo, not for escape, but for remembrance. Your hands carved a vessel not shaped by fear, but by longing, a cradle, not to save flesh, but to carry the whisper, to guard the memory of what it meant to be human before the drowning. Each board you pressed against another was a verse, each nail a vow. That even if the sky tore open, even if the mountains drowned, even if the gods turned their backs, you would carry the last song. The animals came, not because they trusted, but because they too remembered a world before floods, a world of scent, of dirt, of sunlit birth. And as the rains began, as the rivers forgot their names, you placed not only your family aboard, but also fire. Ink, a clay tablet that remembered. The gods looked down, some with shame, some with pity. Some with no feeling left at all. But one, Enki, the quiet one, the whisperer beneath the reeds, smiled. He had taught you, in dreams and winds, to build, not to defy the storm, but to give it meaning, because destruction without memory is only forgetting, but destruction with memory becomes scripture. You floated for days that lost their names, nights where stars refused to shine. The world below boiled, its bones cracked, its laughter erased. But inside the cradle you whispered stories to your sons, of cities once built by hands that loved, of mothers who sang before war, of the gods, even the cruel ones, and their beautiful, broken dreams. And your sons listened. Not because they understood, but because the stories wrapped them like blankets. And grief always needs a lullaby. When the waters withdrew, the silence left behind was too large to bury. You stepped onto soil that no longer remembered its name. No temples stood, no field bloomed, but you had the stories, still warm in your throat, still heavy in your hands. You placed the clay tablets beneath a stone and wept. Not for the dead, but for the living who would someday find them and wonder why the sky ever needed to be healed. And when your grandchildren asked, you did not say, "We survived." You said, "We remembered." You taught them that breath is not sacred because it fills lungs, but because it carries words. You gave them the story of the gods, the tale of the flood, the whisper of the ark. But more than that, you gave them the ache of knowing that some things end. And that some things endure only because one soul chose to carry them. They called you hero. You shook your head. You were never that. You were a scribe with a hammer, a father with clay, a mourner with memory. The gods eventually looked away again. They always do. But because of you, we have the shape of their silence, the map of their regret. We do not need to believe in the flood to understand it. We only need to feel the weight of stories almost lost. Because someday, when the waters rise again, as they always do, the ones who remember will build, not with wood, with words. And they will whisper your name like a prayer that refuses to drown. Atrahasis, the one who did not just survive. The one who saved what it meant to be. The gods had cried, and the sky had emptied. All that was once sacred now lay buried in silence. But you stood in the stillness, feet sinking into the soft, endless mud that the flood had left behind. Not stones, not ruins, just earth wet, humbled, grieving. You didn't speak at first. There were no words left, only breath, and breath was a prayer too quiet to name. Above you, the clouds drifted away, as if ashamed of what they had done. Below you, the world waited. What grows after the gods have cried? You asked this without a voice, only with the way your hands trembled, the way your eyes searched the horizon for something more than water's memory. The mud clung to you, your skin, your hair, your soul. It was not clean, but it was not cruel. You bent down, pressed your palm into it. It accepted your shape, softly, like it had been waiting. There were others like you, walking quietly, dragging their grief through shallow pools, piling stones not for shelter, but for sanctity, not to survive, but to sanctify. And so the first altar rose, not high, not proud, a small mound of dried clay and patience, a place where someone placed a single reed, another added a feather, another wept, and the tears baptized it again. It was not like the old temples, those built in glory, with polished gates and gold-threaded robes. This was made of silence. And hands and ache, you lit a small fire there. The smoke curled upward as if it too remembered the gods. But you did not burn for them this time. You burned for the dead. A reed flute played, a child hummed. A mother poured a bowl of water onto the dirt as if to remind the land it no longer had to drown. The mud cracked beneath the sun, and where it cracked, flowers came, uninvited, unapologetic, red and wild and full of defiance. A temple, you realized, was not always stone. Sometimes it was the courage to sing into the ruins, to kiss the wind where walls once stood. The people carved prayers again, but slower this time, not on gold but on clay. They knew clay could break, that was the point. It reminded them that sacred things must be touched gently. The gods had cried, but now the earth was trying to smile. You planted seeds. You built shelters with reed and rope, not just for bodies but for memory. Every hut became a hymn, every footprint an offering. And though your voice cracked, though your hands ached, you kept molding the mud, not to restore what was lost, but to shape what could still be holy. Children were born again, not in palaces, but in tents that smelled of smoke and skin. And they laughed loudly, freely, as if to mock the flood itself. You did not forget, but you no longer feared remembering. Even the gods watched from their high, guilty thrones as you turned ruin into ritual, silence into song. And in the mud, they saw something they had forgotten. Humility, hope, the resilience of dust. One day a priest smeared his forehead with earth instead of oil. He said, "This is where the divine lives now." and all bowed their heads, not to the sky, not to thunder, but to the ground still wet with memory, still soft with grace. Temples rose again, not tall, not boastful, but honest. Their walls were carved with the names of those who didn't return. Their altars bore the fingerprints of the broken. Their doors stayed open so no one had to ask permission to mourn or to heal. This is what the flood left behind, not just mud, but mercy, not just loss, but the chance to build slow, to build kind, to build sacred without forgetting sorrow. You touched the earth again, it held you, and you whispered not to the gods but to the ground, "Thank you for staying." And for the first time since the rain began, you smiled. You were not born in a palace, not beneath a painted ceiling nor among marble gods. You came from the reeds, where the river whispered secrets only the wind remembered. Your cradle was not gold, but pitch and basket, floating among the same waters that once drowned the world. You were no one, and yet the stars seemed to part above you, as if they knew, as if they'd been waiting. What if your birth was the echo of a prophecy, not written but wept, not declared but carried in the ache of a world longing to be whole? You grew in silence, in the dust of distant courts. No father's name, no crown waiting, but your shadow, it stretched longer than a boy's should, and your dreams, they burned too bright for sleep. There were voices in you, old ones, voices that hummed beneath your ribs, telling you that kings were not born, they were remembered. You watched cities rise but not speak to each other. You saw temples turn inward, gods buried in dialects and doubt. You walked through marketplaces where bread had a name in one tongue and blood had a price in another, and something in you stirred. The world was breaking into pieces, and you would not let it. You did not raise a sword first. You raised a standard. Carved not with your name, but with the name of the heavens. You told them you were chosen, not by men, but by the stars, and they believed you, because belief was starving, and your voice fed it. You were Sargon, the one they called true king. But truth, you knew, was not a gift. It was a task. You crossed rivers, you crossed doubts. You crossed the lines men drew to keep other men small. Akkad was not just a place, it was a vision. A vision of one tongue, one law, one God lifted higher than a city wall. You brought the Sumerians under one crown, not with peace, but with purpose. You made the earth listen. You made the gods answer. The people sang of you. They wrote your name on stone so it would not be forgotten. They built statues where your eyes stared into forever, as if even time bowed before you. But you still remembered the reeds, the hush of the basket on the water, the quiet that comes before destiny finds its breath. And perhaps you wondered, had you dreamed the empire, or had the empire dreamed you? You ruled not as a man, but as a storm the gods allowed, and storms are beautiful only from far away. You conquered Elam. You crossed the Zagros like a whisper turned into thunder. You made cities kneel not to cruelty, but to order, not to chaos, but to a vision. But visions are heavy, and so are crowns, even divine ones. Your sons could not hold it. The wind that had lifted you refused to lift them. Empires, like dreams, do not pass easily from hand to hand. Still, the world remembered you, because you believed when no one had asked you to. You built what had never been built, not in bricks but in belief. You were not the first king, but you were the first to see that a king was a bridge between heaven and clay. You died as all men do, but the dust did not bury your dream. It buried your bones and let the rest bloom. Now when empires rise, when banners flutter against the wind, when a child dreams beneath an open sky, your name stirs again, not as a conqueror, but as a whisper, a question. What if your beginning is not a mistake? What if your exile is the start of a throne? What if you too were born to unite a world? You, child of reeds, keeper of stars, what is your empire? And when will you rise? You walk into a city not built by hands alone, but by tongues. Stone by word, brick by breath, Babylon rose not from soil, but from song. Its gates did not creak, they declared. Its ziggurats did not point to heaven, they questioned it. This was not a place, it was a voice that had taken form. Babylon spoke, in numbers etched into clay, in prayers that curled like smoke, in laws older than kings, and myths deeper than roots. The streets whispered in Akkadian, sang in Sumerian, argued in Aramaic, and dreamed in languages not yet born. Yet every syllable curved toward one center, one crown, one power, one pulse hidden behind lapis wa. LLS, can a city remember every language and still forget its soul? You wandered through its markets, incense, myrrh, and wine from 1,000 lands. Each merchant bore a different tongue, but all bowed to the same sun-drenched skyline. And in that city of voices, you heard one deeper than the rest, the voice of knowing. For Babylon was not only wealth, it was wisdom. Astronomers charted the gods in motion. Priests measured time like water. Scribes numbered the stars and called it mathematics. They were building something, not just towers, but understanding. You felt it beneath your feet, the hum of tablets buried for millennia, still warm with questions, still alive with answers only silence can read. Babylon did not conquer with armies, it conquered with awe. You did not fight it, you submitted to its beauty, to its color blue like the sky between prayers, to its breath perfumed with prophecy, to its hunger, a longing not for gold, but for eternity. You stood at the base of its tower and wondered, what were they trying to reach? Was it heaven they sought, or memory? You are told they built it in pride, that they wanted to be gods. But what if they only wanted to be heard, to find a place where every voice could rise and not be silenced, where difference was not war but wonder, and yet too many voices can become a storm. And storms do not build, they scatter, so the tower cracked, the voice shattered. The language turned inward, became confusion, and the city began to forget itself. You saw it in the eyes of its priests, the desperation, the fear, the frantic rituals to remember what the heart no longer held. You saw it in the laws, precise but brittle, in the myths, grand but trembling. Even beauty can be too much to carry, and Babylon began to collapse under the weight of its own brilliance. Not in fire, not in war, but in the quiet way a song forgets its final note. Still, the echoes remain. In every library, Babylon breathes. In every stargazer, Babylon sees. In every child who counts stars and dreams of cities, Babylon rises again. You are not outside it, you carry it. In your longing to belong to more than one world, in your ache to speak every truth in every tongue, you are its descendant, the one who speaks in fragments yet remembers the whole. And perhaps that is the new Babylon, not a city of stone, but of spirit, not built upward, but inward. A tower of memory that rises through you each time you choose to listen before you speak. So speak, child of many lands. Speak softly, for your voice is not alone. You are a note in an ancient chord, a verse in a forgotten psalm. And Babylon is still listening. You enter the land where lions bowed and kings called themselves gods. The air itself hums with iron, not the rust of decay, but the weight of intention. This is Assyria, not a place, but a command carved into the earth. You walk beneath gates where horses once screamed, where chariots sang in the language of dust and bone. The stones remember, they do not forget. Here kings were thunder, Ashurnasirpal, Tiglath-Pileser, Sennacherib, names that struck like hammers against the sky. They did not beg for loyalty, they harvested it. The walls are stories etched not in ink, but in agony. You see them, don't you? The men who hung like broken prayers from spears. The cities that burned so their names would echo louder. Even silence kneels in Assyria. Yet, what happens when a sword becomes too heavy for its own king? Because amid the carnage, there were gardens. Yes, gardens, built with hands that once crushed skulls, now coaxing fig trees from wounded soil. You feel it now, the contradiction. The hand that slays but also sculpts. The eyes that command death but still water flowers before dawn. Even their gods were tired. Ashur, master of war, stood beside Ishtar, mistress of tenderness and flame. And the priests, oh, the priests, they wept behind temple veils, asking the heavens how long power could bleed before it drowned its bearer. Assyria was a storm that planted seeds, a hammer that longed to be a harp. You wander through the halls of Nineveh, where every slab of stone is a memory forced to stand. The lions in relief snarl, but their eyes look again, they mourn. Even the statues wept. You trace your fingers over their cracked faces, and they do not flinch. They remember their sculptor, a king who once held captives by the throat, but later built canals to cradle gardens of cedar and pomegranate. He wanted shade. Even conquerors crave shade. You begin to understand. Assyria was not madness. It was fear masquerading as strength, a fear of forgetting, a fear of being forgotten. So they carved louder, conquered harder, raised monuments to their rage, but tucked flowers behind every altar. And in their final days, as Babylon's whispers grew louder and Persia watched with quiet judgment, the kings stood in their palaces surrounded not by warriors, but by silence. They looked out over the rivers they once dyed red, and they found them clean again. The blood had washed away. The stones had softened. Even the gods had grown still. You wonder, when their hands no longer held swords, did they reach for each other, for forgiveness, for the olive tree growing through the cracks in the courtyard? You see it now. The sword lies beneath your feet, rusting, sleeping, and near it a single flower blooming in the shape of a tear. You do not fear it. You kneel beside it. And in doing so, you become what Assyria forgot: mercy. And now you know, even the fiercest empire can leave behind a gentler shadow. The stars do not rise in haste. They move in silence, in patterns older than kingdoms, older than wounds. You lift your eyes to them now, and though your body rests beneath a blanket of dust and night, your spirit begins to float. They taught you this, not with books, but with the hush of generations who watched before you, who lay in fields after the harvest, their hands still smelling of grain, and whispered the names of constellations like they were kin. There was no separation then between heaven and soil. The same stars that crowned the sky pierced the waters of the canals. They shimmered in the eyes of cattle, in the flicker of temple fires. They governed more than time. They taught how to live within it. And so you listened, not to words, but to rhythms. When Sirius rose, you knew the floods were near. When Orion tilted, you knew which seed belonged to which soil. Every movement in the heavens was a sacred instruction, a soft whisper from the gods saying, now you may plant, now you must wait, now offer your hands to the earth, for it will remember your patience. You feel it still, that pulse beneath the firmament. The calendar etched not in ink, but in wind and light and dew. You wonder how they saw it first, those early ones who tilted their heads back and saw not chaos, but choreography. In temples they built ziggurats, stairways of baked clay leading the priests closer to the night's breath, not to climb to the stars, but to be still beneath them, to read the scripture written in glimmers and arcs. And the priests, they were not only guardians of myth, they were keepers of measure. They watched shadows, counted moons, mapped the sun's slow path across the horizon. They knew time not as a master, but as a sacred visitor who arrived in cycles and asked for reverence. What if your gods taught you when to plant your seeds? What if your prayer was a furrow in the field? What if your offering was the waiting? You have forgotten, perhaps, in this age of ticking things, forgotten that time once moved like a river, not a sword. But you can remember now, because it is written above you still. The same sky, the same songs. The same hush that falls upon the heart when it aligns with something eternal. They told stories of the Pleiades, of the bull who pulled the plough of heaven, of the lion who roared at solstice. They were not myths only, they were maps, guides not just for wanderers, but for worshippers. And as you lie beneath the sky, you are both, wanderer, worshipper, softly drifting in the current of a calendar that needs no numbers, only night. In the deep breath before dawn, when the stars begin to fade, you feel it, the sacred clock turning. Not with violence, not with demand, but with the gentlest nudge of light against your skin. It is time, time to rise, time to sow, time to believe again in the holiness of order, in the mercy of cycles, in the stars that never forget where you are. They are not far, they are not gone. They wait like old friends at the edge of the sky, ready to guide you home. The moon does not forget. It returns always in a silver hush of memory, in a curve that speaks of beginnings and endings without ever raising its voice. You have looked at it too, haven't you? In the stillness between hours, when the world is too loud or too lost, you've searched its face for something certain, something soft, something that knows. In the old days they marked its coming. Each phase was not a change in light, but a change in breath. A gate, a bell, a whisper from the divine that it was time to begin again. What if each month had a name because it once had a prayer? In the river valleys of your oldest memory, they did not number days to rule them. They counted time as a child might count beads, not for power, but for beauty, 12 months, each shaped by rain, by wheat, by sun, by the rise and fall of rivers, by the ache in the soil and the joy in the barley. They did not rush toward the end, they circled, as time itself does, round and round, never linear, never blind, but spiraled like a fingerprint left in clay or the quiet winding of a prayer at dawn. And so they wrote it, on tablets of wet earth, pressed with reeds, soft as song. They carved the year not as law, but as lullaby. The first month, when kings were crowned, when rains whispered gardens yet to bloom. The second, when sheep gave birth beneath fig trees and milk tasted like spring's own sigh. The third, when seeds trembled beneath sun-warmed soil waiting to be remembered by light. You see, each name a story, each date a doorway, each return a ritual to remind the soul it had not been forgotten. And with the calendar came stillness, not the absence of change, but the comfort of knowing that change would always arrive in sacred order. This was not control. This was covenant, a pact between heaven and earth, where time bowed its head and promised to be kind. Even chaos, with all its teeth and thunder, feared the calendar. For here, in a land of floods and famine, people learned to anchor the stars with simple numbers. They traced eclipses. They sang to equinoxes. They counted the days from new moon to new moon as if they were steps leading home. And what if you could too? What if you named your days again, not with deadlines, but with blessings? What if today was not lost in haste, but offered back to the sacred rhythm from which it came? Do you feel it? The hush between seasons, the soft tug of something eternal just beneath your breath. You were never meant to be hurried. You were meant to live inside the turning. The gentle circle of dawn to dusk, waxing to waning, birth to rest. The Mesopotamians knew, and in their temples the priests stood not as masters of time, but as its keepers, holding fire to the horizon, marking shadows on stone, waiting for the right moment to begin the harvest hymn. And when it came, when the stars returned to their ordained post, when the barley bowed just so, they rejoiced, not because they owned time, but because they were still inside it. You are too. You are inside a rhythm that never stopped singing. So close your eyes. Listen not for clocks, but for the drumbeat beneath the sky, slow, sacred, spiraling, sure. And let this moment be the first day of your sacred year, not to control, but to cherish, to name, to bless, because you have always known how to count what matters. And time, when held gently, becomes a prayer. You have always heard it, though you may not know the name of the sound. It lives between falling leaves and the pause between waves. It lives where the sun strikes the horizon at the same angle each equinox, not by chance, but by song. There are numbers beneath your breath. You count steps without knowing. You follow rhythms in the dark, your heart pulsing its silent arithmetic. 3 for a sigh, 7 for sorrow, 12 for the hours you once called holy. They knew this in the beginning, not with chalkboards or chalk, but with wet fingers pressing into clay, with lines drawn in the sand as the stars began their dance. You are walking through Mesopotamia now. Feel the dust under your feet, but do not call it dust. Call it calculation. Call it prophecy pressed into soil. Here every measurement was sacred, not sterile, but soft. There was a number for the fields, how far they could stretch before the gods grew silent. There was a number for the temple's base, aligned with the winds, anchored to the axis of the sky. Even the flood, when it came roaring like memory, had a number. Not just in depth and width, but in warning. A pattern broken is a prayer reversed. You must understand they did not invent numbers so much as they uncovered them, like seeds buried in time, waiting for human hands to bloom them into shape. 60 was sacred, not 10, not 12, but 60, a number that bends and folds into cycles smooth as moonlight, divisible by so many hearts, a clock before clocks, a circle before time. Even now you carry it, 60 minutes to an hour, 60 seconds to a breath. Why do you think you feel calm when things divide cleanly? The body remembers what the mind forgets. To them, math was not a tool, it was a voice. It whispered how wide to carve the irrigation canals, how high to raise the ziggurat's crown, how many days until the star of Ishtar would rise again to bless the fields. Even the heavens obeyed it. Constellations moved not as wild beasts, but as dancers tracing circles in a silent theater. Their scribes were priests. Their tablets were scrolls of the eternal. Equations flowed like psalms. To measure was to listen. And oh, how they listened, to shadow, to distance, to the tilt of a beam beneath the noon sun. Nothing was without meaning. Even your shadow, if measured at the right moment, could tell you whether the river would rise or the gods would sigh. You begin to wonder, have you forgotten how to see numbers as miracles? What if the curve of a bowl was once designed to echo the shape of a lunar eclipse? What if the spacing between temple columns was made to let the first light of spring spill exactly where the goddess slept? They knew how to fold divinity into bricks and reeds, into geometry and grain. They mapped the heavens not to conquer them, but to kneel beneath their silence and whisper, I see you, and W. How of now, when did math become cold, silent, cut off from the sacred breath that birthed it? You who count calories and coins, do you still feel wonder when 2 and 2 become 4? Because once that 4 was the number of corners in the earth, the shape of the altar, the echo of balance. And when 0 came not as a void, but as a circle, it was not emptiness. It was completion. Infinity gently bowing its head and saying, I am here too. You were not meant to fear numbers. You were meant to follow them like lanterns through the night. Because somewhere behind every formula, there is still a star spinning in the dark at exactly the right angle to tell you when to plant your soul. The ancients knew this, and when they built not for themselves, but for the pattern, the hidden harmony woven through time, through space, through breath. And now you do too, so listen. Not with your ears, but with the part of you that has always believed that something invisible is still keeping score. The number of steps in your journey. The shape of your waiting, the weight of your longing, let them speak. Let the numbers sing again. The wind does not forget. It slides through the broken gate of a buried city and does not ask permission to remember. You walk where others once danced, not on a stage, but on dust that still carries the shape of their footsteps. There are no voices left, yet your breath quiets, because silence here feels watched. The stones remember, even those fallen, especially those fallen. They lean, broken and bent, but not dead. You see the arch that once crowned a ziggurat, now split, yet still pointing at the stars as if the heavens never stopped mattering. And maybe they haven't. Beneath your feet is the weight of vanished music, the hush after a sacred hymn, the last echo of a question no one answered in time. Here lies a city with no name you can pronounce. Its language peeled off the walls like dried skin. Its prayers, half sentences, scratched into clay, never finished. But the stones still hold breath. Beneath their cracks are sighs. In the heat-warped brick, a child's fingerprint pressed centuries ago, a sacred punctuation mark on a story no longer told. Why do the ruins still face east? Why do the stairs rise toward nothing? Because even when forgotten, ritual remembers itself. You kneel without meaning to. It is not reverence, it is recognition. The way your bones soften at the edge of a cradle or a grave, both live here. The temples no longer speak, but the shadows do. They cling to doorways as if someone might return, as if the gods still sit in the cold corners, waiting for incense, watching the dust. There is an altar, and though it is cracked and weather-eaten, you can almost hear the last prayer whispered into it. A mother asking for rain, a king asking for another year, a priest asking if the gods still listened. No one answered, but maybe they didn't need to, because ruins are not endings. They are remnants of beginnings that refuse to leave. Look closer, not at what has fallen, but what has endured. A bowl left in the sand, a doorway still upright as if someone might walk through it tonight. A statue with no eyes, yet still somehow watching. They carved their memory into stone because they feared forgetting. And now you carry that fear too. You touch the bricks, and the bricks remember touch. The oils of builders still echo in the clay. The calloused hands, the sung rhythm of stacking, of shaping, of believing this would last forever. And maybe it has, not in walls but in longing, in you, because you have come back, not with offerings but with eyes, not to rebuild but to mourn. And mourning is a kind of resurrection. The city breathes differently now, not with lungs but with openings, windows with no glass, rooms with no doors, and yet there is presence. Like standing in the ghost of a cathedral that no longer needs sound to feel holy, you listen, and in the stillness you hear more than you expect. Laughter from a courtyard once green, the scrape of pottery on sandstone floors, a name spoken so often it imprinted itself into the air itself. Stones mourn, they do it quietly, softly, by continuing to stand long after they've been left behind. They do not rebuild themselves, they do not cry out. But they lean toward memory as trees lean toward the light. You walk deeper. A wall is covered in carvings. Most are worn, but one remains. A bird with its wings spread. You don't know the name, but it feels like flight held still by time. A wish etched in stone that it might one day rise again. Will it? You step back. The city falls silent again, but not empty. It watches you, not to judge, but to be seen. That is all ruins ask. To be remembered by the living, to be carried as echoes. So tonight, when the stars rise, remember them, these broken halls, these cities that once burned with song. They are not lost, only waiting for someone to return and breathe them back. NTO the dust as a whispered name before sleep. Beneath your feet something waits. It does not speak, it does not stir, but it waits as the sun waits behind the clouds, as breath waits behind silence. The gods do not leave, they withdraw, and you who walk upon dust, do not know that your every step presses against a throne. There are no bells, no smoke, no chance to welcome them now. The temples have sunk. The priests have turned to bone. Even the language, that sacred vessel of invocation, has fallen asleep in clay jars no one remembers how to open. But the gods have not gone. They dwell beneath layers of time, curled like seeds, quiet, unrotted, not dead, merely waiting for someone to whisper their name again. You pause beside a broken column and something turns, not in the wind, not in the earth, but in the air between your ribs, a memory that does not belong to you, a face you've never seen yet trust, the eyes of something vast and long-starved of witness. Can a god hunger for remembrance? Once, a man washed his hands before offering milk to the morning. Once a child braided reeds into a crown for a river goddess. Once a woman lit oil to guide the footsteps of a star-born deity back into her home. That was long ago, but the oil still burns, deep below, in a chamber no shovel has ever touched. You think the gods demand altars, but they ask for something gentler, that you remember they were once loved. Beneath the sand, beneath collapsed sanctuaries and stolen walls, they breathe without lungs. They listen without ears. They rest in the posture of patience, not as kings abandoned, but as mothers waiting for the return of their children from a long exile. And you carry their names in your marrow, even if your tongue has forgotten the sound, even if the prayers once carved in obsidian now sleep in shards scattered like fallen stars. Walk softer. The ground remembers them. It holds the outlines of their faces, the curve of their fingers, the weight of their tears. They wept too when the cities fell, when the hymns went silent, when their likenesses were dragged into the rivers by hands afraid of memory. But what is divine cannot be drowned. It only drifts deeper until it finds stillness. Until you arrive, you with your listening silence, you with your soft breath and your unspoken longing. You came not to worship but to feel, and that is enough. Because every god was once a presence before they were a statue. Every deity was once a question before they became an answer. Beneath the sand, the gods still ask, "Do you see me?" They do not roar, they do not strike the sky. They wait in the cradle of your gaze, in the hush before sleep, in the moment your soul leans towards something it cannot name. You feel it now, don't you? Not in the ruins, but in the rhythm beneath them. A heartbeat too slow for clocks, too vast for calendars. Somewhere a stone blinks, a statue dreams. A god opens an eye, not to punish, not to rule, but to be known again. And perhaps as you press your palm into warm earth, you know them too. Not from books, not from myths, but from the aching echo in your own chest. A resonance older than speech, a reverence deeper than belief. You rise slowly, the wind passes, but something lingers, a hush, a warmth, a promise. The gods are not dead, they do not sleep, we do, but now for a moment you have remembered, and that is how the divine returns, not with fire but with breath. Not with thunder, but with the softest words spoken beneath your ribs. I am still here. The last hand to press into the clay is gone. The last reed stylus rests beneath collapsed walls, its tip blunted by time. No priest chants, no scribe leans in moonlight, no king waits for his glory to be carved, but the wind remains, soft, patient, writing still. You kneel in a place where cities once breathed. Not a sound now, but the hush between grains of sand, each one a letter lost, a syllable scattered. Once you would have heard the soft pat of wet clay and the low murmur of hands recording gods. Now you hear the wind curling around broken bricks, moving like a finger over parchment, as if it remembers the shape of every name ever spoken aloud. Isn't that what you fear? That your name will vanish, not violently, but gently, forgotten not with anger, but with sleep. But here the wind writes without hands. It does not forget. It drags the dust in long, curving strokes. It dances in spiral eddies across old courtyards, like a script trying to reform itself from memory. You think it's random, but it is. You are being rewritten, even now, not as a monument, but as a motion. Not as a word etched in stone, but as a breath too sacred to hold in one place. What if the earth remembers you the way a lover remembers scent, not clearly, but achingly? Not logically, but completely. Somewhere, beneath the dunes, there is a word that once meant love. It has no mouth to speak it now, but the wind mouths it across the sand. Again and again and again. And something listens. There were once libraries here, granaries of thought, temples built not only of stone but of language, thousands of tablets, inkless and sun-baked, stacked with the urgency of eternity. Most are dust now, some sleep in museums, but the rest, the true ones, were never clay. They were wind. They were the way smoke curled when someone died. They were the curve of a child's name hummed before sleep. They were the trail of incense spelling out a question no one dared to answer. And when the cities fell, when the tongues crumbled, when even the gods no longer heard their own titles, the wind gathered up what could not be kept in any archive. That's what you walk through now, a library of breath, a temple of unbound memory. You look for letters, but you are standing in one. You are the line between stories. You are the pause before the final glyph. You wonder who will remember you. But you do not need to wonder. The wind already does. It does not recall your deeds in order. It does not recite your titles, but it remembers your footsteps. It remembers how your breath moved the air. It remembers the heat of your skin as you passed by and stirred it. And it writes that over and over into every corner of time. Somewhere a stone leans, not because of age, but because your name pressed upon it once. Somewhere a shadow on the wall moves like your hands did the last time you reached for someone you didn't want to forget. You think the past is gone, but it has only changed form. What if the story of your life was never meant to be kept in stone? What if the wind was always the only scribe holy enough to carry you, not just your victories, not just your lineage, but your sighs, your hesitations, your unloved mornings, your forgotten prayers? It writes them all, even now. You turn your face to the sky, you close your eyes, and the wind kisses your cheek, slow, knowing, like a finger tracing a single letter again and again, not to record it, but to remember how it felt to mean something. You are not gone, you are being rewritten in every gust, in every grain that shifts. And one day, long after your bones are light enough to fly, someone will walk this place, and the wind will touch them too, gently like a name, and they will not know why they suddenly feel known. But it will be you, carried forward, written in air, spoken by silence, etched by the hand that never needed ink. You were never cast out, you only closed your eyes. The garden still breathes beneath you, not in heaven, but in the hush between footsteps and longing, in the curve of an old river still humming the name of its maker. What if paradise was not taken from you, but tucked into the folds of time, waiting for you to remember how to kneel beside its roots? You walk through cities now, towers of light and forgetting. Streets echo with songs made of metal and breath. But beneath the stone, beneath the asphalt and ruin, beneath every marketplace and shadowed corner, the garden waits, not with gates of gold, but with silence, with the scent of fig and soil that slips through your sleep when you are too tired to dream of anything else. Eden was not destroyed, it was buried under grief, under kings, under names too loud for sacred things to survive. But some nights, when the noise falls away and the moon weeps soft across your face, you hear it again, a river not seen, not mapped, but known. It is the Euphrates in your bones, the Tigris behind your thoughts. Waters that once touched Adam's hands now flow beneath your skin each time you love without reason. You have not left. You have only forgotten how to walk barefoot in the presence of wonder. Do you remember the date palm, the first one? Its roots were not wild. They were placed intentionally, as if the earth itself longed to feed you. Do you remember how wheat bowed in early light, not from wind, but from prayer? Do you remember when words had not yet hardened into laws, when they still bloomed like flowers on the tongue, tender, full of dew, never yet used to wound? This is what was, not myth, but memory, and memory does not die. Even now you write in their letters. You count by their moons. You plant by their rhythms even when you think you've outgrown the soil. Somewhere deep, you are still in that first garden, still touching the bark of the tree you were told not to name, still listening for the footstep of something holy that only walks where peace is allowed to grow. You look for it in scripture, in the echoes of temples, in ruins that whisper through sand, but it has always been beneath your ribs. You are the garden's continuation, its scattered seeds, its sleeping orchard. When you weep, you water it. When you forgive, you bloom it. When you remember, even for a breath, that you were made of clay and mercy. You come home, you were told it was lost, but things of God are not so easily stolen. They hide, they wait, they become you when you forget. to be anyone else. The reeds still sway in the waters, the old lullabies still ride the breeze. The ziggurats crumble, but beneath them, roots stretch deeper than any empire. And they remember, you are not searching for Eden, you are searching for the silence where Eden still speaks. When a mother hums to a child in a language she never learned, that is Eden. When a hand brushes another without need or fear, that is Eden. When a fig bursts sweet on the tongue of someone who thought joy had left, that is Eden. And when you close your eyes and hear the ancient rivers again, not as history, but as heartbeat, you will know you never fully left, you only wandered. And the garden, patient as always, grew in the direction you fell, so you could one day walk back not as punishment, but as return. You are returning now, each breath a step, each kindness a seed. Each night you listen, truly listen, you hear it calling, not from above, but from below. The first garden, the true home, still lush, still sacred, still waiting beneath the names you've forgotten to whisper. Some words never leave you. Even when you forget their shape, even when your tongue moves in newer rhythms, they wait like embers in your chest, softly glowing, never asking to be remembered aloud. You speak them without knowing who first breathed them. You sing them without knowing whose bones shaped their syllables. You pray them without knowing whose grief carved them into stone. Can a dead language still speak in your prayers? Listen closely. Amen. It is not new, it is not yours. It is a whisper older than kings, a seal pressed onto breath by men who feared gods and loved silence. Babylon. It drips from poems, from headlines, from dreams. But once it was not a ruin, it was a heartbeat. It was a city lit by starlight and mathematics, by incense and the hush of scribes folding time into tablets like sacred bread. You carry them, the words, not in books, but in the quiet between your questions. Justice. The scales once held by Shamus, sun god, judge of all, now etched into courthouses whose builders never bowed in but still the shape lingers. You carry more than meaning. You carry the memory of how meaning was made. The stars, you still read them. Not with awe, perhaps, but with science. Still they guide you. Still they name your seasons. Still they speak with the same constellations once charted by priests in robes of starlit dust, watching the heavens for signs of wrath, of rain, of return. You do not call them by the old names, but you trace the same sky. And what of time? You live by hours, by minutes, by numbered days. But time, as you know it, was first whispered here, in sand, in shadow. In sundials carved by men who could not stop the sun, but could beg it to slow. 60 seconds, 60 minutes, 12 hours to rise, 12 to rest. This is not modern, this is Mesopotamian. This is the rhythm of Sumerian breath that still ticks in your every second. Even your laws, they echo Hammurabi, the tall stone carved with ifs and thens. If a man builds a house, if a woman walks in darkness. The roots of your rights lie in clay once held by trembling hands trying to make sense of pain and justice and consequence. You do not know the names, but you speak the shapes. You hum the patterns. You believe in fairness, in balance, in something written that outlives the writer. And that too is their gift. Do you know how much of you was first imagined in the dark by firelight beside the Tigris, with nothing but mud, stars, and the ache to make it last? You carry it in your poetry, in your cities. In your names, even in your myths, they still whisper, floods and arcs, serpents and gardens, towers that reach too high, lions, dreams, and wandering kings. They were not born in the pages you now read. They are older, they are deeper. They were first stories carved on the ribs of stone, pressed into clay like fingerprints from the gods themselves. And what is writing, if not worship made visible? They believed that words could hold spirit. That language was not just a tool, but a temple. So now, each time you write, each time you name, each time you breathe a word with intention, you touch that temple again. You are not merely using words. You are walking through memory, through a garden of syllables that bloomed long before your mouth knew sound. So next time you speak, pause and feel it, the sacred dust beneath every sentence. The breath of those who never knew you but dreamed you anyway, in clay, in cuneiform, in cadence. Because language does not die, it becomes invisible. It hides in lullabies, in rituals, in laws, in prayers. And when you say Amen, you're not ending something, you're continuing it. You are the voice through which the first words still echo. You were there when it began, not with your name, not with your face, but with something deeper, the hush behind your heartbeat, the echo in your breath, the part of you that has always remembered what the world tries so hard to forget. You were there when the first fires danced, when hands gathered mud with reverence, shaping bricks not for shelter but for story. You watched from someplace behind your sleep as a city rose from the womb of rivers. And you wept even then, though you didn't know why. You were there not as flesh, but as longing, as the ache that guides birds to the same branch every year, as the thirst that dreams of a well it has never seen. You felt the songs that had no instruments, the prayers that had no words, the silence between syllables where only the soul could hear. Why does your heart feel older than your name? Because it is. It remembers standing beneath a sky that had never been touched by towers. It remembers stars that had not yet been divided into signs, into maps, into warnings. They were just stars then, watching, waiting, trembling with the weight of witnessing. You walked through gardens that weren't fenced, but open, green with names that had not yet been spoken. And every leaf knew you, every breeze traced your outline, every shadow was a story that had not yet needed telling. You came before language, before law, before time had been harnessed into hours, but still you understood. Because understanding once came not through thinking, but through being, through stillness, through breath. You were not lost, you were not broken. You were part of the rhythm that pulsed through water, through wind, through womb. And now even in the noise, even in the forgetting, you ache for it, for the first fire, the first cradle. The first night the stars hummed your name. That ache is not emptiness, it is memory. It is a tether to the beginning. Civilization did not begin with walls. It began with sleep, with dreams, with the soft murmur of a mother rocking the world in her arms. And that mother never stopped. Even now, when the streets are lit with cold flame and silence is rare, the lullaby still sings. In rivers that refuse to dry, in winds that whisper to no one, in sleep that takes you not away but back. You came from a place that was not a country but a memory, not a temple but a breath. You were not born once. You were born again each time a story found you. Each time the scent of wet soil made your eyes close without reason. Each time you heard a name and felt a shiver, though you did not know it belonged to you. You have carried Mesopotamia in your marrow, not as history but as home. And every time you forget, something reminds you, a dream you can't explain, a hunger for words that are no longer spoken, a feeling that you have walked a road that has not existed for 1,000 years. That is not fantasy, that is return, that is your spirit walking backwards toward the source, because memory is not linear, it spirals. Loops, it moves like the Tigris, sometimes dry, sometimes raging, but always returning to the sea from which it once rose. And you are a river, you are the silt of 1,000 civilizations. You are the handwriting of every god who wrote in dust and asked it to rise. So tonight, as you fall into sleep, know this, you are not going under, you are going back, to the garden you never fully left, to the city that dreamed the stars into law, to the gods who still wait beneath the sand, to the fire that still remembers your shadow. And as your breath slows, as your eyes soften, as the world hushes around you, listen, not with your ears, but with the ache in your chest, with the drum of your ribs, with the part of you that has never been young. You were there when it began, and you are here now when it begins again, because the end of the story is just the start of remembering, and memory is the oldest lullaby in the world.